the ability to perceive your environment.
Okay, so being able to experience or perceive what's going on around you, right? So you're collecting information. The information is coming in, it's going to the brain, and then the brain is where you're going to process that. You're going to try to figure out what it is that you are experiencing. Okay, so sensory function, sensations, and perception. So the sensation is the actual raw impulse as it's going from the receptor to the brain. So that's that electrical impulse that is going to be sent when a receptor is stimulated. The perception of it is how you are going to experience it. So like the amount of light, okay? So for some people, a certain amount of light might be too much. It hurts your eyes, like when you're looking through the microscope, right? So your level of brightness may be different from someone else's level of brightness, or the temperature, you know. What you think of as hot may be different than what someone else thinks of as hot. So your perception has more interpretation in it. Okay? Motor commands for skeletal muscles. So your skeletal muscles, right, you're able to control them voluntarily, right? It's not an involuntary thing where it happens automatically. So your brain is going to be able to send out that command. Higher mental functioning, memory. We're going to talk about memory in a minute, and reasoning, and how that relates to, remember we talked about action potential, right? What do we mean by action potential? What is it? Right, so that is that movement of the charge, the change in the voltage, right? We talked about voltage differences and all that, the depolarization, and what causes that? The movement of ions, right? So how is memory and learning and understanding related to the movement of ions? Well, that's what it is. So connections between the neurons in specific ways are going to allow you to make connections to different parts of the brain, and the way that they are connected is through the movement of the impulse from one neuron to another. So it seems kind of obscure, right? Thinking about ions moving and, you know, the electrical charge and action potential and all of that, but that is how our neurons are functioning. So there's also neural centers for coordinating muscular movement. So we'll talk about that. We've got regulating visceral activities. What do we mean by visceral? Internal organs, right? Think of visceral as your guts, right? All the digestive organs, everything on the inside there, the heart, the lungs, that's visceral. So those internal organs. And then also your personality. So another strange thing to think about, your personality is controlled by ions moving across the membrane? Yes. Okay, because that's how those neurons are functioning, but you have the connection of different neurons from different areas of the cortex of the brain that are controlling these mental functioning.
So I have a quick question.
Okay.
Someone with sensory processing disorder, where does that go wrong? Is that the ion coming back down?
So
The brain infection?
sometimes with things like that, and I can't speak specifically to that, but just in general with differences that we have in things like that, the brain can be wired differently for different people. So the connections of the neurons they're just connecting differently than the average, normal, organized pattern of the neurons in the brain. And so having those different connections can cause, like, people may be overloaded with sensory information because those connections coming in are different than what you would expect, for that particular part of the brain. So that's one thing that can happen. Another thing, as we talked about with neurotransmitters, right? So differences in levels of neurotransmitters can be excitatory, right? So if you have too much of the excitatory stimulation, neurotransmitter stimulation, then that can affect how you are perceiving and experiencing things. So it can be different things like that, but the organization of the neurons and the neurotransmitters are the biggest things. So the parts of the brain, we're going to talk about specific parts of the brain. This is the major portions here. So we have the cerebrum. The cerebrum is this whole wrinkly part here in the diagram. It's all of this part that looks just like all wrinkled up. That's the cerebrum. Okay, the largest part of the brain is the cerebrum. Okay, and then we have the diencephalon. So the diencephalon is this middle part right in here. The diencephalon is made up of the thalamus, the pineal gland, the hypothalamus, and the posterior pituitary gland. So we're going to talk about those specific parts in a minute. All right. The cerebellum is down here. It is inferior to the cerebrum. It is posterior to the brainstem, which is this part right here. And it has two hemispheres. So the cerebrum also has two hemispheres, so two major portions to it. And then the cerebellum at the bottom also has two hemispheres. Then we have the brainstem. So here's the brainstem. The brainstem is made up of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. And the brainstem connects to the spinal cord. It's really all one continuous structure. There's not a division between the brainstem and the spinal cord. It's really just all one part. And so the brain and the spinal cord, as you guys know, make up what portion of the nervous system? The central nervous system, right? The CNS. So it's really all connected, one structure. The neurons from the brain go into the spinal cord, and the brainstem provides that pathway area for those neurons to continue through. And then also in the other direction as well. So we have going up and going down through the area. All right, so how the brain develops. It starts out once the cells start dividing, and it divides into a tube. So the cells divide and they make this little tube called the neural tube. And that's going to give rise to the parts of the central nervous system. And you can see here the early neural tube here. It has these three basic sections to it. And the cells start to differentiate in those sections. And they start to form vesicles, or like little pockets there. And the cells within those three different pockets divide and have characteristics to them that are going to lead to the more developed structures of the brain as they continue to divide. So we have the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. Okay, and then it also has these other terms that mean the same thing: the proencephalon, the mesencephalon, and the rhomencephalon. Okay, so forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. It goes red, blue, yellow there. And then you can kind of follow that as it continues to develop. The cells are dividing, right? And as the cells are dividing, they are becoming more differentiated, more specialized. The more times they divide, the more specialized they become in producing this nervous tissue. Okay, so here the forebrain is going to continue to divide there and form the telencephalon and the diencephalon. So remember, we talked about the diencephalon as one of the major parts of the brain that exists in the fully developed brain, right? That middle part. Okay, the telencephalon is going to divide into like the frontal lobes and the cerebrum, right? And then the mesencephalon in the middle is going to continue to persist. And then we have the neural tube down here. It's still a tube, and there is actually, as we talked about the ventricles, right? That opening in there. So the tube actually persists, and the opening continues all the way down through the spinal cord in the form of the central canal. So as it's dividing and producing more and more tissue, it retains that opening all the way through for the ventricles and for the central canal for that circulation of spinal fluid, cerebrospinal fluid. So the 5 cavities persist, right? So that's the ventricles and those connections there. So on this, I'm not going to give you like a diagram and you've got to be able to point out where the different parts of the neural tube are developing. That's not important. The biggest thing here is the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain there, and knowing that as the tissue develops, it's going to produce the other structures of the brain, and then also here knowing that the ventricles are going to persist as that opening on the inside. So when you think of a tube, think of like a water hose, right? It's got the opening on the inside of it. Okay, this table is just further information, same, you've got the different parts over here. It talks about the ventricles and those connections there, and then the regions produced. So this would be a good summary to study. All right, so let me get my brain model, and we're going to, actually, I'm going to give everybody a brain model. Okay, so the different parts of the brain, as we go through this, I want you to look at the brain model that you have and kind of compare it. and then I have an activity that I want you to do. And by the end of your practice and what we're going to do today, you're going to need to know all of the parts of the brain. I have a list on the board behind the screen here. And so when we're done with a certain part of the lecture part, then I'll show you the list, and then you guys need to work on finding all of those parts and learning that on the brain. Okay? So that's one of our objectives for today. So let's go through it first. I'll show you on here. I'll show you on my brain model. You find it on your brain model, and then you'll have more time to practice in just a little bit. All right, so the cerebral hemispheres. The cerebral hemispheres, remember the cerebrum, that's that big wrinkly part. So what we mean by hemispheres, there's two sides to it, right? So this is the left hemisphere. This is the right hemisphere, right? So the two sides to the cerebrum. All right, the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum joins the two hemispheres together in the middle. Okay, so if you're looking at your half brain there, your hemisphere, this white streak right here is the corpus callosum. Okay, that joins the two sides of the cerebrum. All right, the corpus callosum. All right, the gyri and sulci. Okay, singular would be gyrus and sulcus. Okay, so the gyri, these are the parts that are sticking up. So the ridges on there, those are the gyri. The sulci are the indentions where it folds in. Okay, the crevices in there. Those are the sulci. So gyri and sulci. Right? A fissure. A fissure is a deeper groove in the brain. So, for instance, the longitudinal fissure is this deep indention that goes all the way down to the corpus callosum that divides the two sides. So a fissure is just a deeper groove. Okay, there's also the transverse fissure back here that divides the cerebrum from the cerebellum. Okay, so that's a fissure.
Are those the only two fissures on the brain?
No, there's other ones, like for instance right here. This is really like just a deep sulcus, but I would say it's borderline fissure, and there's some books that actually use the term fissure there, but transverse.
You need to know the names, like where the longitudinal.
Right, you do. Yeah, so this book calls it lateral sulcus there, so we'll just say the two fissures are going to be longitudinal and transverse. But as you're, looking at your brain, you can see that this temporal lobe here actually does come apart, and you can see down in there on some of them. Some of the brains that you have, they don't come apart, but you can see that it is a deeper area there. All right, so now let's look at the lobes. All right, so the lobes on this brain here, they're color-coded, right? On the ones that you have, they're not color-coded, so you've got to think about where the border is for the different lobes, okay? So they're named based on the bones. So we've done that with the muscles, right? We had that with the names of the bones, and so now the lobes of the brain are using those same terms. So we've got the frontal lobe here, and the frontal lobe goes back to the central sulcus. Now the central sulcus can sometimes be hard to find on these brain models, okay? You may have a blood vessel that is stuck down in that central sulcus if you have one of the brains that has the blood vessels on it, okay? But the central sulcus, if you'll kind of look down at it, it's about halfway on the brain, maybe a little bit further towards the back, and there's a little bit of a deeper groove that goes down, and it goes down towards the temporal lobe here, okay? So the frontal lobe is in front of the central sulcus, and the parietal lobe is behind the central sulcus. Okay, so think about the parietal bones right here on your skull, right? So parietal here. Then at the back, we have the occipital lobe. Remember the occipital bone right here, okay? So the occipital lobe is this part right here on the back above the cerebellum. Then on the side, this is where the temporal bone would be, right? The temporalis muscle. This is the temporal lobe. You can see that right here, temporal lobe. Right? And then we have, as I mentioned before, the lateral sulcus. It's a deep division there. And then you have the insula. So the insula, we don't have a bone that's named for, right? But if you have one of the brains that kind of comes apart, so it comes apart in a couple of pieces, you may be able to get in there to the insula. This one doesn't really come apart like that. It comes apart differently, but right in here, if you pull off that temporal lobe, you can kind of see inside there. That's where the insula would be, okay? And just the pattern of the cerebral tissue in there is like kind of a clump in there. And so the insula would be right under that lateral sulcus, okay? So the 4 lobes that you see from the outside are named for the bones, and then the 5th one is under here, like under the temporal lobe, okay? So those are the lobes of the cerebrum. Okay, the cerebral cortex versus the white matter. Okay, so the cortex is the outer portion. So the cerebrum here, there's like the outer like area of the cerebrum is made up of gray matter. Okay, so a thin layer of gray matter. On the inside of the brain is white matter. Okay, so the cortex is the outer part, it's gray matter, the inside is white matter. Do you remember we talked about what causes the nervous tissue to have the white appearance? Think about cutting into a steak. What's that white stuff that you're going to see in there? The fat, right? So what part of the neuron that we talked about has lipids in it? You guys were saying it earlier. The Schwann cells, right? So the Schwann cells, that you find them in the peripheral nervous system, but in the central nervous system, you have a very similar cell, it's a longer name, oligodendrocytes. Okay, the oligodendrocytes do the same thing. They form that myelin sheath on the axons, all right? And the myelin has the lipids in it. So in the white matter of the cerebrum, that's where you have that the myelinated axons, right? The lipids. In the gray matter of the brain, the cortex, is where you have unmyelinated parts of the neurons. The cell bodies are unmyelinated. So you're going to find 75% of the cell bodies of the nervous system are found in this outer layer of the cerebrum. Okay, the cell body part, that's where you have the nucleus, right? That's where the dendrites are attached, and then the axon goes from there and goes through this white matter area. Okay, now remember, just a matter of speech with this, we had motor for the meninges, right? So we had dura mater, arachnoid mater, and pia mater. Okay, one T. For gray matter and white matter, it is matter, M-A-T-T-E-R. Okay, so try to remember that. And you know there's a difference there, right? Because the mater, the meninges, those are layers, protective layers on the brain and the spinal cord, but the matter is made up of the neurons. Okay, so gray and white matter. Functions of the cerebral cortex. This is where our higher level mental functions are controlled. This is like our reasoning. This is memory. This is your understanding. This is judgment. Things like that. So voluntary movements. Retrieving stored information. The seat of intelligence and personality. Okay, so the cerebrum, the cerebral cortex, that's the part of your brain that really makes you who you are, right? The white matter of the brain, that's just a pathway of the neurons going through, but where you have all of your interpretation and your personality and all that, that's that outer part, the cortex. And there are specific parts of the cortex that are going to relate to specific functions, right? So it's very specific areas that control things like understanding speech, like being able to formulate speech. Okay, so we'll look at those specific areas in just a second. Right, so here we have, you can see the lobes here. Here's our central sulcus. So find the central sulcus on your brain model again. That's this division right here. Remember, the frontal lobe is in front of that, and the parietal lobe is behind it. Okay, and so the division there is the pre right here, meaning before, right? So the pre-central gyrus, and then here we have the post-central gyrus. So the central sulcus is in the middle, pre-central before it, post-central after it. Okay, gyrus is the ridge, right? Those are specific areas. The pre-central is a motor area. The post-central is a sensory area. Okay, and we'll talk about specific locations on just those ridges that we know control or are collecting information from specific parts of the body. Okay, then we come down here, the occipital lobe. Always remember the function there, that it's the visual area, because I know somebody that fell and hit the back of their head and they temporarily lost their vision. Right? That visual area right here is where you have combining visual images, visual recognition of objects. The eyes were still working, right? That person's eyes were still working. There was nothing wrong with their eyes, but when the information got back to the brain, it wasn't processing it. And so they temporarily lost their vision from hitting the back of their head, the occipital cortex back there, the visual area. All right, so visual here, and then we have over here, so the ear would be like about right here, right? So think about these functions here having to do with hearing, right? So you've got the auditory area here, you've got the Broca's area here, and the Wernicke area here. Broca's and Wernicke are both involved with speech, okay? So those areas are going to be involved. Go to the next page. Wernicke's is your sensory speech, Okay, understanding and formulating language. Sensory speech. What does sensory speech mean? So what's the difference between sensory and motor? So you've got motor speech and sensory speech. Right. And then me talking to you and you understanding me is sensory, right? But you talking to me is going to be motor for you, right? So you've got two different areas. They're close by there, right? One is sensory and one is motor. So the Wernicke's area is going to be the sensory area where you're understanding language, and then the Broca's area, it's on the next page, I think. The Broca's area is where you are formulating the speech. Okay? Let's see, I think we went over. Okay. So the cutaneous sensory area. Cutaneous. Do you remember in another chapter we used the term cutaneous? Remember subcutaneous? What system was that involved with? The integumentary system, right? So the skin. So here we have the cutaneous sensory area. Interpret sensations on the skin. Okay? So specifically interpreting those sensations here within this area here. This is our post-central gyrus there. Then we have the visual area. We talked about that. Auditory area right here would be under the ear area. Sensory for taste. Okay, the base of the central sulcus includes part of the insula. The insula is going to be right under here, right? And so this area for taste is going to be right in that area under that temporal lobe. Okay, the sensory area for smell arises from centers deep within the temporal lobe. Okay, so we'll talk about the olfactory nerve and where it goes. It goes under here from the inferior surface of the frontal lobe back in here to the temporal lobe. And then that's where that information is going to be processed. Okay, first let's talk about sensory. So sensory areas are here on this side. This side over here is motor. Okay, so we're going to talk about sensory first. The sensory area is depicted here in yellow. This is the post-central gyrus. Okay, so again, how do we know which one is pre and which one is post? Behind what thing?
The central
sulcus.
Yeah.
Yep, exactly. So behind the central sulcus is this sensory area. So that's going to be the post-central gyrus. Okay? That whole area, both sides, is sensory. Okay? So that ridge going down. And we know the specific areas of the gyrus that are receiving sensory information from specific areas of the body. Here's a good question. How do you think we knew this before any of the technology? Because they actually knew before you could do like scans of the brain and all that kind of stuff.
They know, like dissecting.
Okay, so dissecting and seeing differences in the tissues, that helped. But as far as the function, okay, rats, they did use other animals. That's true.
They like electric shocks to certain parts of the brain.
Okay, that's one thing that they did do. Even before that, think about the person that I was telling you they hit the back of their head and they lost their vision. Well, that tells you that, so injuries that people experienced and they survived, if they had a specific area of the brain that was injured and they lost function or they lost sensation from a part of their body, then they realized, okay, well, that specific part of the brain controls this. Okay, so we knew a lot of information from injuries before we developed technologies to kind of reinforce that information. All right, so here we have sensory information from abdominal organs is coming in here, the tongue, the throat, the teeth and the gums, the lips. The lips have their own area there. The lips are very sensitive, right? The upper face, the hand, fingers, and thumbs. Look at what a large area the hand, fingers, and thumb have. Why would that have such a large area for sensory information?
Because there's a lot more nerves on your hands, because that's what you use to reach out and touch things, and so that's how you perceive your environment.
Right, so it's really important, especially humans, right? Being able to manipulate your fingers, all of that. And does anybody play instruments in here? Okay, I always try to play piano, but I'm terrible at it. But is there sensory involved with the motor of being able to play? You need to be able to feel, like if you play guitar, right? You need to be able to feel saxophone, right? You got to know where the different parts are so that you can then use your motor movements. So sensory is important in being able to experience things, and to then we'll look at over here. So this is motor. Motor has just as much space for it, because especially humans, our hands, our opposable thumb. I can't remember if we talked about that before, but the opposable thumb is a very important thing that humans have. Okay, then you have the forearm, the arm, the neck, the trunk, the pelvis, thigh, leg, foot, and genitals. So it all has these specific areas within this gyrus here for sensory. Okay, the association areas. So you have areas that are not fully motor, they're not fully sensory. It's association, it's a combination, and you have connection there. So areas that connect other structures of the brain, analyze, interpret sensory experiences, provide memory, reasoning, verbalization, judgment, and emotions. Okay, we'll talk about our limbic system. The limbic system is your emotional system. Okay, so that'll be coming up in just a second. So here's these association areas. Frontal lobe association areas: concentrating, planning, problem solving, emotional behavior, judging consequences of behavior. So this frontal lobe association area, I saw a thing on TV where this guy had done a study. I think he was a neuroscientist. I don't know specifically what his area was, but he was doing images on the brains of serial killers, and he saw patterns that they have in the frontal lobe. There's a certain pattern of the nervous tissue in the frontal lobe that serial killers have in common, most serial killers. And he tested all these people, and he kept coming up with the same thing. But here's the thing, he looked at his own brain, and he had that same pattern. He had the pattern of a serial killer, but he himself was not a serial killer, right? So that tells you that you have this particular structure, right? That is your nature, right? What you're born with. But then there's also influences, nurture, how you were treated, how you experience things through your life. And so there is almost an equal nature and nurture. So your nature, that's your genetics, that's what you're born with. Nurture, how were you treated, what was your upbringing, what's your value system, things like that. And so you still, if both of them are going to contribute to how you act and whether you're going to be a serial killer or not, right? So, so there may be things like that, but it's going to come back to how you developed your system of judgment and things like that as well. The parietal lobe, understanding speech, choosing words, express thoughts and feelings. Okay, temporal lobe, association areas, sensory experience, understanding speech and reading. We talked about the Wernicke's area there. Storing memories of visual scenes, music, complex patterns. The one thing about these association areas, do you ever associate a smell with something that happened in your life, right? So maybe you had some experience and maybe it was pleasant, like grandma's house, at Christmas. Or maybe it was something that was unpleasant, like a strong smell, from a wreck or an accident or something like that. And that brings back those memories. So in these sensory association areas, that's where you make those connections and connections between neurons. That's where your memories are stored. Okay, so you can have sensory connections with the neurons that are storing your memories. Okay, occipital lobe, as we talked about, the visual areas, and then the insula, that inner lobe, right, where you have information for proper emotional responses. Proper emotional responses. You ever just have, like, later on you're like, gosh, that was just the complete wrong emotional response. Why did I cry when that happened? Or why did I laugh when, they told me that? So sometimes, because of all these connections you have to different parts of your brain, different memories that you have, sometimes you're just going to come up with the wrong response. And, nothing you can do about it, right? So you just try to filter yourself sometimes.
Did you ever see Inside Out?
Inside Out. Who?
Disney movie. It's about emotions, like memories and stuff. It's really good.
I don't think I saw that.
You should watch it.
Okay. Was there like little characters in it, and were they in the brain or they were somewhere? Yeah. Okay, I remember seeing pictures of that, but I never saw the movie.
We watched it in psychology.
That sounds cool. I'll check it out. All right, so primary motor areas, the Broca's area, and frontal eye field. So your primary motor areas, okay, so now we're talking about motor. That's information going out. Remember, sensory is coming in, motor's going out, okay? So you have the primary motor area controlling voluntary muscles, okay, and then the Broca's area, as we talked about, muscles for speech, and then frontal eye. This is going to be movement of the eyes and the eyelids. Right, here we are on the motor area here. And so it's very similar to what we had here with sensory. This is going to be the precentral gyrus, so in front of the central sulcus. And again, you've got a lot of area for the face, facial expression. Facial expression is very important for communication, right? It's nonverbal communication. If someone's eyes get big and they raise their eyebrows or they scrunch their face, you know what that means, right? And one thing that we have to deal with our communication is that we have lost some of that ability because we communicate so much with text, right? And so it can be hard to really understand what someone is trying to tell you because you can't see their face, right? And you can't hear their voice and how they are saying it. If somebody says okay, okay can mean, yeah, okay, let's do it. Or it could mean okay, or okay. You know, it just depends. If one word, you could put a period after it. My daughter always gets upset because I use punctuation, right? And she's like, Mom, why are you being so mean or whatever? If I text her, she can't understand. Okay, I'm just using punctuation. The way I'm saying okay in my head is different than how she is reading my okay.
The worst part is sending emails, because I know that it's like formal and proper to put
Right.
like proper punctuation with periods.
Right.
But it feels so like sudden.
Yeah.
Succinct. So I put a bunch of exclamation marks. I'm really excited with all of my emails, and I know that it's not a good look.
That's how you have an argument, you should call a person.
Yes.
You know?
Definitely. It's very hard to clear up a disagreement through text, because if a person is already upset, then they're going to be reading all of your text in their upset voice, right? And it's very, so communication and the parts of your brain that are wired for communication are not necessarily, customized for text communication. And that's something, now we have emojis, right? And so you have to use emojis sometimes, even though you're not laughing and crying and all of that, but you have to use the emoji so that they know what type of emotion you're trying to convey, right?
Can you imagine if every time we use an emoji, we were actually doing what that emoji is?
Yeah.
Going up, like shitting, like,
Yeah.
like crying. Like,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, but you have to, right? And we know what it means now. We know, if you do like the laughing emoji, you may not really be like laughing out loud, right? But you know what it means. My mom, she's in her 80s, and so technology, when she was a little kid, they had an outhouse, they had a mule and wagon, and now she is, dealing with all this technology. But when she first started really using email, she would do everything in all caps and send emails in all caps. And I was like, Mom, you can't do that. She was doing it because it was easier for her to see. Yeah, she was like bold, all caps. She could see it. But I was like, that really it means that you're like yelling when you do that. So it took her a little while.
And like when he first, started his career, they typed everything on typewriter. So everything was in caps.
Yeah, because it's easier than having to do all of that. Yeah.
So he types like that now, and I'm just like, Dad, like, he's like, oh, that's all it is. Bold.
Yeah.
My grandma doesn't even use a cell phone. She tries to talk to Alexa, and she's like, Alexis.
Yeah.
And it doesn't answer her, and she's like, what the hell's wrong with Alexis? And I'm like, well, her name's not Alexis, so that's probably what's wrong with her.
Have you seen the Saturday Night Live skit about Alexa? Oh my gosh, it's so funny. It's about old people like trying to talk to Alexa. It's perfect. And I was showing that to my mom, and she actually knew what Alexa was. But my dad was sitting over there, and he can't hear good anyway. And so I was talking to my mom, and he said something, and she was like, "You don't even know what Alexa is." And he said, "Yes, I know what Alexis is. It's a car." Like, no.
They're so cute.
So, sensory, motor, different parts of the cortex. Yeah. And then he was like, "It's a car." And Lee, that's my cousin, Lee had one time. He didn't even have a Lexus. He had a Nissan. I'm like, yeah.
That is so funny. Oh, God.
So, hemisphere dominance. the left hemisphere is dominant in most people. So most people do have left hemisphere dominance. Sometimes people will have right hemisphere dominance, and sometimes people will have equal, like codominance, okay, of the hemispheres. So they don't have one side that's more dominant over the other. The dominant hemisphere controls the language skills of speech, writing, and reading. So verbal things, analytical, computational. The non-dominant controls nonverbal things, motor, understanding and interpreting musical and visual patterns, provides emotional and intuitive thought processes. Okay, and so we know different people have different types of intelligences. Some people are math whizzes. Some people are great with language and writing. Some people are musical. They're musical geniuses. Some people are sports geniuses, right? They're at the top of their game. They, whatever it is. So there's a lot of different intelligences that people have, and different parts of the brain are more tapped into. Like, we all have these different structures, but it's a matter of how is the brain wired to be able to allow you to be able to control your muscles or your, whatever you're using for these specific tasks. All right, so let's take our break here for memory, and then before memory, and then we will come back and we'll work on the cerebrum or the parts of the brain, and I'll have the list ready for you.